The line between safety and disappearance on the 18th century frontier was drawn thin, often no wider than the width of a cabin door or the space between a ploughed field and the forest's edge. Life for European settlers in the backcountry of North America was defined by its isolation. Wooden cabins stood scattered miles apart, carved from wilderness where the nearest neighbor might be a day's ride away, and where every journey beyond the clearing carried with it the possibility of ambush. Families rose before dawn to tend livestock and fell asleep to the distant sounds of wolves or the shifting creak of trees, always aware that the next noise might not be nature at all, but footsteps. The colonies were not simply extensions of Europe. They were contested landscapes, overlapping zones of ambition where English, French, and Spanish empires collided with the deeply rooted nations of the Iroquois, Abenaki, Shawnee, Cherokee, and countless others who had lived there for generations. Every treaty line was temporary, every boundary subject to sudden and violent revision. In that volatile world, raids were not exceptional events, but part of the fabric of life. Frontier families built their homes with rifle slits and escape cellars, taught children to stay quiet at the first hint of hoofbeats, and sometimes slept with their boots on. Yet no matter how vigilant they were, many families awoke to find their doors broken, their fields burning, and loved ones gone. Women and children were taken most often, not simply because they were more vulnerable, but because they were valuable. To rival nations seeking leverage, to native villages replenishing populations lost to disease and war, and to colonial militias who saw captives as bargaining chips in prisoner exchanges. A raid could sweep through a valley in minutes, leaving behind silence and ash, and by the time news reached the nearest fort or town, the captives could already be deep in the interior, days ahead of any pursuers. The assumption among settlers was always the same: those taken were lost forever. Captivity was spoken of in the same breath as death, and often with more dread. The woods beyond the fields were imagined as a realm of savagery and despair, where no Englishwoman could survive. Without being brutalized or broken, sermons thundered about heathen cruelty, and newspapers published lurid tales of torture and degradation. These narratives reinforced a picture of the frontier as a one-way threshold. Once crossed under duress, there was no return. The few who did come back were treated as living ghosts, their stories distorted to fit colonial fears rather than reflect the truth of their experiences. But the reality was far more complex. Many captives were indeed forced into hard journeys, marched barefoot through forests, their fates uncertain as they were distributed among villages or traded along alliances. Yet many others found themselves not in chains, but in homes, adopted into families who mourned their own losses and saw new kinship in those they brought back. For native societies, taking captives was often less about revenge than renewal, a way to replace members lost to epidemics, to forge political bonds, or to strengthen a community's future. Children could become sons and daughters, wives, could become integral members of a clan, and even those who resisted at first could find acceptance and purpose over time. To colonial eyes, this possibility was unthinkable. In a culture that equated captivity with degradation and civilization with Englishness, the idea that a woman might live, even thrive, among those branded as enemies struck at the heart of their worldview. It was easier to believe the vanished were dead than to imagine they had chosen a different life. And yet, as the decades passed and conflicts multiplied, from King Philip's War to the French and Indian War, the pattern repeated itself. Cabins burned, riders vanished into the forests, and years later news would surface of a woman seen among the Haudenosaunee, a child now speaking the language of the Shawnee, a wife who had been given the chance to return, but declined. The frontier was not merely a line between wilderness and settlement. It was a porous, shifting space where identities were remade and loyalties transformed. For every family that grieved a vanished daughter, there was a native household that welcomed a new one. And for every story of loss whispered around a colonial hearth, there was another, harder truth moving silently beneath it, that some of the lost were not lost at all, but found something in their captivity that they had never known in their former lives. It was this quiet, unsettling reality that would shake frontier society to its core, when the women and children they had mourned as victims revealed in their choices that captivity was not always a tragedy, but sometimes an awakening. The story of captivity on the North American frontier cannot be separated from the wars that made it possible. From the mid-17th to the mid-18th century, the continent became a battleground where empires and nations clashed not only with armies and treaties, but with raids, kidnappings, and the forced movement of human lives. King Philip's War in 1675, one of the bloodiest conflicts per capita in colonial history, set the pattern. It was not simply a military struggle between New England settlers and a coalition of Wampanoag, Narragansett, and Nipmuc warriors. It was also a campaign waged against households, fields, and communities. Villages burned to ash overnight, and captives were not incidental spoils, but deliberate objectives. The taking of women and children both crippled the enemy's morale and replenished the population of those who had lost loved ones to disease and warfare. It was a practice rooted in necessity and tradition, one that would outlast the war itself and define the frontier for generations. The same dynamic intensified during Queen Anne's War, the North American theater of the War of the Spanish Succession, which raged from 1702 to 1713. This was a war fought not just between England and France, but by their indigenous allies, the Wabanaki Confederacy, the Iroquois, and others, who carried out raids deep into enemy territory. Frontier towns such as Haverhill and Deerfield became targets, their inhabitants caught in a cycle of reprisal and counter-reprisal. In February 1704, the raid on Deerfield by a combined force of French soldiers and Kanawake Mohawks left more than 100 English settlers dead or captured. Survivors were forced to march through the winter wilderness toward Canada, many dying along the way. Among them was 7-year-old Eunice Williams, whose decision decades later to remain with her adoptive Mohawk family would scandalize colonial society. But at the time, such captives were seen as bargaining tools, their fates entwined with diplomacy. They could be exchanged for French prisoners, ransomed by families, or kept as members of indigenous households, and the uncertainty of their futures was itself a weapon. By the time of the French and Indian War in the 1750s, the economy of captivity had become deeply embedded in the fabric of colonial conflict. Raiding parties sought not only supplies and intelligence, but also people. The British and French empires, locked in a global struggle for dominance, both encouraged such tactics, understanding that human lives could shift alliances or destabilize settlements. Women taken from burned farms, isolated cabins, or shattered wagon trains were often presumed by their communities to be doomed, destined either for death on the trail or degradation in distant villages. Colonial narratives painted their suffering in lurid detail, emphasizing brutality and despair. Preachers used their stories to warn congregations of the savagery lurking beyond the tree line, reinforcing the idea that captivity was a fate worse than death. And yet, beneath those narratives lay a quieter, more complicated reality. Some captives were treated harshly, subjected to forced marches, scarcity, and unfamiliar rituals, but others were fed, clothed, and given a place in households that needed their presence. For many native nations, the taking of captives was not an act of cruelty, but of restoration. Epidemics had decimated populations. Warfare had claimed countless lives. To adopt a captive into the community, sometimes through elaborate ceremonies, that symbolized rebirth was to heal those wounds. Women, in particular, were often integrated into families as daughters, sisters, or wives, roles that carried real respect and agency within many indigenous societies. This stark divergence between expectation and reality produced a tension that colonial society struggled to comprehend. Settlers could imagine their wives or daughters suffering. They could even imagine them dead, but they could not imagine them thriving, building families, raising children, and forging identities within the very cultures they had been taught to fear. When some captives refused ransom or resisted repatriation, their choices were seen not as acts of agency, but as signs of madness or corruption. Colonial leaders drafted sermons and pamphlets to explain these decisions as evidence of brainwashing or sin, because to acknowledge that a woman might freely choose life among the so-called enemy was to question the moral and cultural foundations of their world. The wars that shaped early America were brutal, and captivity was one of their most enduring weapons. But they also created spaces where the lines between conqueror and captive, victim and survivor, blurred in ways no one expected. For every story of a woman who perished in the wilderness, there was another of one who found belonging where she was least expected to. And for a society built on rigid notions of civilization and identity, those unthinkable choices were perhaps more threatening than any musket or torch. In the winter of 1676, as King Philip's War raged across New England, the fragile sense of security that English settlers clung to on the edge of the wilderness collapsed in fire and blood. The conflict, born of decades of encroachment, broken. Treaties and mutual distrust had already consumed entire towns, but for one woman in particular, the war would become something more personal, an ordeal that would shape colonial memory for generations. Her name was Mary Rowlandson, the wife of a Puritan minister in Lancaster, Massachusetts Bay Colony. On the morning of February 10th, she awoke to the sounds of gunfire and screams. A coalition of Narragansett, Nipmuc, and Wampanoag warriors descended on the town, burning houses and slaughtering those who resisted. When the attack ended, more than a dozen settlers lay dead, including one of Mary's relatives, and she and her 3 children were among the survivors taken into captivity. The image that would later emerge from her ordeal, and from the widely read narrative she published after her release, was one of brutal suffering. Rowlandson described the violence of the raid in harrowing detail, recounting how she was wounded and how her youngest daughter, Sarah, died in her arms from injuries sustained during the attack. The early chapters of her narrative became emblematic of the colonial view of native warfare, chaotic, merciless, and beyond comprehension. To English readers, such accounts confirmed what sermons and rumors had long insisted, that captivity among indigenous peoples was a descent into barbarism, a test of faith in a world stripped of order and civility. Yet beyond the shock and grief, Rowlandson's experience unfolded with layers of complexity that defied the simple narratives her readers wanted. As the captives were marched deeper into the wilderness, she expected cruelty and degradation, but what she encountered instead was a spectrum of behaviors that did not fit neatly into the colonial imagination. She was given food, however meager, and was allowed to sew clothing for her captors in exchange for sustenance. At times she was treated with a degree of respect and even kindness, offered shelter during storms, permitted to visit her surviving children in other camps, and never subjected to the physical abuse that many Englishmen assumed was inevitable. Rowlandson herself struggled to reconcile these realities with her worldview. As a devout Puritan, she interpreted every moment of her captivity through the lens of providence and scripture, framing her survival as a testament to God's will. Her captors were often described as heathens and infidels, their actions signs of divine punishment or testing. but scattered throughout her account are moments that reveal a reluctant recognition of their humanity. She wrote of individuals who comforted her, who shared their scarce provisions, who mourned their own losses and endured the same hunger and cold that she did. These fleeting observations, often buried beneath layers of theological interpretation, hinted at a more complicated truth, one in which captors and captives were bound not only by violence, but by shared vulnerability and resilience. When she was finally ransomed after 11 weeks in captivity, Rowlandson returned to a society eager to consume her story. Published in 1682 under the title The Sovereignty and Goodness of God, her narrative became one of the first American bestsellers, reprinted multiple times in both the colonies and England. It was read as a tale of steadfast faith under unimaginable adversity, reinforcing the idea that the frontier was a savage wilderness and that those who survived it did so only through divine favor. But in shaping public opinion, the narrative also solidified a cultural framework that saw captivity as an experience defined solely by suffering, a framework that left little room for the nuances she herself had glimpsed. The enduring influence of Rowlandson's account went far beyond her own life. It became the template for a genre of captivity narratives that would proliferate over the next century, shaping how colonists understood and feared their indigenous neighbors. These stories were political tools as much as personal testimonies, justifying expansion, fortification, and retaliation. And yet, beneath their stark portrayals, the deeper truths of captivity persisted, sometimes visible only in the cracks of the narrative. Mary Rowlandson's ordeal was unquestionably traumatic, marked by loss, fear, and dislocation. But it was also an encounter with a world that colonial society refused to see, a world where enemies were not monsters but people, capable of cruelty and compassion alike. It was that hidden complexity, unspoken yet undeniable, that would haunt the colonial imagination long after she returned home. Long before European colonists arrived in North America, the Haudenosaunee, the confederacy known to outsiders as the Iroquois, had developed a deeply rooted practice for healing the wounds of war and grief. It was called the Mourning War, and at its heart was not conquest or plunder, but restoration. When a member of a clan was killed, the balance of the world was believed to have been disturbed. Sorrow, if left unresolved, could weaken the community. To mend that tear, warriors would take to the field, not always in search of vengeance, but of people. Captives were brought back not as slaves to be exploited or enemies to be humiliated, but as potential kin, new lives who could fill the empty places left by those who had died. This concept of replacement ran deeper than mere symbolism. It was a spiritual and social necessity, a way to ensure that the cycle of loss and renewal continued unbroken. For many women and girls taken in such raids, the experience they encountered was utterly unlike what colonial society imagined. In Puritan sermons and frontier rumors, captivity was portrayed as a fate worse than death, a brutal descent into savagery where English women would be reduced to property. But among the Haudenosaunee, the reality was often the opposite. A captured child might be ceremonially washed of her old identity, dressed in new clothes, and given a new name. An adult woman might be brought before the matriarchs of a clan, the powerful elder women who guided political and social life, and formally adopted as a daughter or sister. Once adopted, she was no longer considered a prisoner. She belonged. Her duties, rights, and protections were the same as those of anyone born into the clan. This transformation could be bewildering, even frightening, for those taken from colonial households. Yet over time, many captives adapted, and some came to cherish their new lives. Haudenosaunee villages were structured around communal support and reciprocity. Women worked together in longhouses, shared childcare responsibilities, and wielded significant influence over decisions. Their labor sustained the community, and their voices shaped its future. For English women accustomed to the rigid hierarchies of colonial life, where property, politics, and even spiritual authority belonged almost exclusively to men, this new status could be startling. Some who had once been ministers' wives or farmers' daughters found themselves with a degree of autonomy and respect they had never known before. To colonial observers, this reality was incomprehensible. When captives were ransomed or rescued, many refused to leave their adoptive families, prompting outrage and confusion. Settlers, who had spent years searching for lost daughters or sisters, were stunned to find them speaking Haudenosaunee languages, wearing moccasins and beadwork, and insisting on staying where they were. Colonial newspapers described such choices as evidence of brainwashing or moral corruption, while clergy warned that prolonged contact with heathens could erode Christian virtue. Yet those explanations said more about colonial fears than about the women themselves. For many, their bonds to their new families were not born of coercion, but of genuine love and belonging. The psychological shift that adoption created was profound. Once a captive had been accepted into a clan, she was expected to mourn the person she had been, to let her old identity die so a new one could live. This act mirrored the mourning that had brought her there in the first place. In the Haudenosaunee worldview, the dead were not forgotten, but neither could the living remain trapped in grief. Adoption was a ritual of renewal for both sides, for the family that had lost someone and for the individual now given a second life. This practice also challenged European notions of warfare and victory. Colonial armies fought to destroy, subjugate, or seize land. The Haudenosaunee fought to heal, to balance the scales of loss, and to sustain their communities. Where Europeans saw captivity as degradation, the Haudenosaunee saw it as transformation. This clash of worldviews ensured that the stories of adopted women became some of the most shocking and unsettling on the frontier. They revealed that cultural power did not always flow from guns and forts, but could be asserted through kinship, ceremony, and care. And they forced settlers to confront a truth they had never anticipated, that their daughters and sisters might not wish to be rescued at all. In the longhouses of the Haudenosaunee, where fires burned through the winter and stories of ancestors were told beside drying maize and furs, many women taken from colonial worlds were not prisoners. They were family, daughters reborn in a society that saw them not as spoils of war, but as part of the eternal cycle of grief, memory, and renewal. Their presence was a living reminder that the frontier was not simply a line dividing two worlds, but a space where identities could be remade and loyalties could shift in ways neither side fully understood. On a frigid night in February 1704, the small frontier town of Deerfield, Massachusetts, slept under a heavy blanket of snow. It was a settlement on the edge of empire, where English colonists carved their lives from contested land and built their churches and homes within rifle range of the forest. That night, as the wind howled through the palisades, warriors from Kanawake, Abenaki, and other allied nations moved silently through the drifts, accompanied by French colonial troops from New France. Their mission was part of a broader struggle between France and England for control of North America, a proxy war fought through raids, alliances, and captives. When they struck just before dawn, the town was unprepared. Doors were smashed in, roofs set ablaze, and the settlement's defenses collapsed in minutes. Dozens of settlers were killed, and more than 100 men, women, and children were taken prisoner. Among them was 7-year-old Eunice Williams, the daughter of Deerfield's Puritan minister, John Williams. The captives were forced on a brutal midwinter march northward through deep snow, covering nearly 300 miles toward French-held Canada. Many perished along the way. from cold, exhaustion, or wounds sustained in the raid, but Eunice survived. For her family, the ordeal was unimaginable. Her mother, Eunice Williams, had been killed during the raid, and her father, though eventually ransomed, spent the rest of his life trying to bring his daughter home. For the English settlers who read his published account of the attack, she was the very image of innocence stolen, a child ripped from civilization and cast into barbarism. Yet the story that unfolded in the decades that followed defied every expectation they held. Upon arrival in Kanawak, the Mohawk Catholic mission village near Montreal, Eunice was adopted by a Mohawk family who had lost a child. The practice was rooted in a tradition that valued captives not merely as spoils of war, but as replacements for those taken by disease and conflict. She was given a new name, Aongote, often translated as she who has been planted somewhere else, and with it, a new identity. Her captors did not treat her as a prisoner. She was raised as one of their own, learning the Mohawk language, participating in their daily life, and eventually embracing Catholicism, which had taken root in Kanawake through Jesuit missionaries. Over the years, colonial authorities, clergy, and her family attempted repeatedly to ransom or retrieve her. Envoys were sent, letters exchanged, and promises made, but each attempt failed. Eunice resisted the overtures, and as she grew into adulthood, her decision became irrevocable. She married a Mohawk man named François Xavier Arrozen, bore children, and lived the rest of her life within the Kanawake community. She occasionally visited her New England relatives, but she always returned to her adopted home, a choice that scandalized Puritan society. For her father and many others, her refusal to return was a profound betrayal, a symbol of how deeply captivity could corrupt identity and loyalty. Yet to view Eunice's story solely through the colonial lens is to miss its deeper meaning. Her choice was not the result of coercion or ignorance, but of belonging. By the time she reached adulthood, the world she had been born into was no longer hers. She had grown up surrounded by people who loved and protected her, speaking a language that felt natural on her tongue, living within a culture that gave her a place and purpose. The English society she had left behind, rigid, patriarchal, and unforgiving, offered none of that. To return would have been to become a stranger in the land of her birth. Eunice Williams's story struck at the heart of colonial assumptions about identity, faith, and civilization. It revealed the power of indigenous adoption practices, the permeability of cultural boundaries, and the possibility that what colonists called captivity could become a chosen life. Her descendants still live among the Mohawk today, a living testament to the fact that cultural transformation did not flow in only one direction on the colonial frontier. For English settlers who believed their world was inherently superior, this was perhaps the most unsettling truth of all, that a daughter they had lost to war had found something they could not offer, and that she had chosen to stay. For those who did return from captivity, the home they had dreamed of during sleepless nights in the forest was often not the home they found. Women and children who stepped back across the threshold of their old lives were expected to resume them as if nothing had changed, but captivity was not a pause, it was a transformation. Months or years spent in indigenous villages, absorbed into new families, speaking new languages, and moving to a rhythm entirely unlike the one they had known before, left many profoundly altered. What awaited them on the other side of the frontier was not the warm embrace of familiar faces, but a society that struggled to accept who they had become. Colonial communities, steeped in strict hierarchies and deeply suspicious of difference, often viewed returnees as damaged goods. The very fact that they had lived among those branded as enemies was enough to cast doubt on their purity, their faith, and their loyalty. Some were questioned relentlessly about their experiences, pressed to recount details of rituals, speech, or beliefs as if they were spies or sinners in need of confession. Women who had married or borne children while living among native families were treated even more harshly. In the rigid logic of Puritan morality, such relationships were evidence of defilement, even if they had been formed through kindness, love, or necessity. A woman who returned with a child of mixed ancestry might find herself whispered about, shunned, or even barred from certain community rites. The psychological dissonance was just as punishing. For many, the life they had once known now felt foreign. Colonial society was defined by hierarchy and obedience, by male authority in the home and the pulpit, and by a social order in which women were expected to be silent and submissive. In contrast, life in many native villages had been markedly more communal. Women shared labor and childcare, held influence in decisions, and were woven into the social fabric in ways that were both visible and respected. They participated in councils, managed agricultural production, and often controlled property, roles that were unimaginable in most English towns. Having lived in a society that valued their contributions beyond the domestic sphere, many women found it difficult to return to a life where their voices were once again constrained. Language itself became a barrier. Some captives returned, speaking only the language of their adoptive families, needing translators to communicate with their own kin. Children taken young and brought back years later were sometimes unable to remember their birth names or recognize their relatives. Others found themselves yearning for the foods, songs, and ceremonies that had once been strange but now felt essential. This sense of displacement, of being caught between two identities, was deeply unsettling. A woman might be physically home, yet spiritually and emotionally still bound to the village she had left behind. Some resisted reintegration entirely. There are records of captives who fled back to their indigenous families after being rescued, vanishing into the forests rather than endure the suffocating expectations of their former world. To colonial society, these acts were seen as proof of corruption, evidence that time among native peoples had erased their civilized nature. But to the women themselves, the decision was often less about rejecting their past than about choosing the place where they felt most whole. In the villages where they had once been strangers, they had become sisters, mothers, and valued members of a community. The life that had begun in violence had grown into something deeply human. Even those who stayed carried the weight of that dual identity for the rest of their lives. They lived between two worlds, never fully belonging to either. Their memories and loyalties divided. Their stories revealed the deeper human dimension of captivity, not just as an episode of loss and return, but as a transformative crossing of cultural boundaries. The frontier was not a simple line between civilization and wilderness, good and evil, us and them. It was a permeable space where identities blurred, where lives were remade, and where a person could stand at the doorway of her old home and realize that, in some fundamental way, she no longer belonged inside. For colonial society, this reality was profoundly unsettling. It challenged the notion that English life was inherently superior and that anyone who tasted it would inevitably return. The choices of these women, some staying, some leaving again, many living in the shadowed space between, forced settlers to confront an uncomfortable truth. The people they had once pitied as victims had discovered possibilities beyond the narrow confines of their own world, and sometimes, when given the choice, they walked back toward the forests and did not look back. For European settlers on the frontier, captivity was imagined as a state of bondage, a condition to be endured, escaped, or redeemed from. They saw it through the lens of their own society, where captives were often prisoners, slaves, or bargaining chips stripped of agency and identity. But for many indigenous nations of North America, the concept was entirely different. Among the Haudenosaunee, Shawnee, Lenape, and others, captivity was not merely about taking people. It was about remaking them. It was a deeply rooted system of adoption, a social and spiritual process through which captives were transformed into kin and communities rebuilt themselves after loss. To understand why so many who were taken chose to stay, one must first understand the cultural foundations of this system, a society of adoption, not chains. Central to this worldview was the idea of balance. Warfare and disease had taken a heavy toll on native populations long before and after the arrival of Europeans, and every death left a void, not only in families, but in the spiritual order of the world. Mourning wars were one means of restoring that balance. When a loved one was killed, grief was not simply an individual burden, it was a communal wound. Capturing someone from an enemy group and bringing them into the community was a way to mend that wound. It was not vengeance alone that motivated the taking of captives, but the need to heal, to restore a family that had been broken. This process was marked by ritual and symbolism. Captives were often cleansed in ceremonies that washed away their old identities, a symbolic death followed by rebirth into a new life. They were given new names, new clothes, and new places within the kinship network. A woman might become a daughter to a grieving mother, a sister to those who had lost one, or a wife to a man whose family had been shattered by war. Children might be taken in as sons and daughters, raised without distinction from those born, into the clan. In these acts of incorporation, the community was not merely replenishing its numbers. It was reaffirming the sacred web of relationships that bound it together. The concept of kinship in many indigenous societies was expansive and flexible, far broader than the nuclear family model familiar to Europeans. It was based on mutual obligation and shared labor, where belonging was defined not by blood, but by contribution. Once adopted, a person was expected to participate fully in the life of the community, to plant corn, gather firewood, hunt, cook, and care for children. Through this work, captives forged real bonds with those around them. They were not outsiders living at the margins, but integral members of the collective, their worth measured by their willingness to share in the responsibilities of daily life. This inclusiveness was often startling to those taken from rigid colonial societies. In Puritan New England, social order was hierarchical and exclusionary. Class, gender, and religion dictated one's place, and opportunities for agency, especially for women, were limited. In many indigenous villages, by contrast, women held significant authority, controlling food production, property, and even political decisions. A woman adopted into such a society could find herself respected and listened to in ways that would have been unimaginable in her former life. For children, the experience was even more transformative. They grew up surrounded by people who loved and accepted them, who did not see them as outsiders, but as vital parts of the future. Spiritual rebirth was not a metaphor, but a lived experience. In their new roles, captives participated in ceremonies, storytelling, and seasonal rituals that tied them to the land and to the ancestors of their adoptive people. They were taught the values of reciprocity, balance, and respect, principles that shaped every aspect of community life. Over time, these teachings could become more familiar than the religious doctrines they had once known. It was not unusual for former captives to lose interest in returning to their birth communities, not because they were coerced, but because they no longer felt like strangers in the places they had come to call home. For colonial observers, such transformations were deeply unsettling. They shattered the assumption that European society was inherently superior and that anyone removed from it would yearn to return. The fact that many captives chose to remain with their adoptive families was interpreted as proof of corruption or weakness, yet the truth was far simpler and more profound. These societies offered them something they had never experienced before: unconditional belonging. In a world where identity was fluid and kinship could be remade through ceremony and choice, captivity ceased to be a prison. It became a passage from grief to renewal, from isolation to community, from who they had been to who they could become. The violence of captivity did not end when the raids were over. For many families on the colonial frontier, the months and years that followed a loved one's disappearance became their own kind of battle. A desperate, drawn-out struggle against distance, language, culture, and choice. The belief that no one would willingly remain among their captors ran deep, and so they wrote letters, gathered ransoms, and dispatched emissaries into the forests and villages beyond the colonial line, convinced that any woman or child taken could be persuaded or compelled to come home. But again and again, those missions ended not with joyful reunions, but with bewilderment and heartbreak. The daughters and sisters they sought had not been imprisoned in the way they imagined. They had built new lives, formed new loyalties, and in many cases refused to return at all. One of the most striking features of this era is the sheer volume of correspondence that survives. Letters sent from colonial governors to French officials, from ministers to Jesuit priests, from fathers to children they had not seen in years. They are written in the language of yearning and authority, mingling pleas for mercy with assertions of paternal right. A father might beg for news of a daughter taken at age 10 and now grown to womanhood among the Haudenosaunee. A brother might offer land, money, or livestock for the return of a sister he barely remembered. In some cases, entire expeditions were organized at enormous cost, with soldiers and interpreters sent deep into unfamiliar territory under white flags to negotiate. The release of captives. Yet many of these missions failed, not because the captives were unreachable, but because they did not want to leave. Time and again, envoys reported the same baffling scenes. A woman stepping forward, listening silently to the words of her kin, and then gently declining the offer. Some were polite but firm, insisting that they were now part of another family. Others avoided the meetings altogether, slipping away before the delegation arrived. There were even cases where captives who agreed to visit their old communities fled back to their adoptive villages within weeks or days, unable to reconcile themselves with the world they had once known. The pain this caused to colonial families is difficult to overstate. Parents who had prayed for years for a child's return were forced to confront a reality they had never prepared for: the possibility that their child did not see herself as lost. Husbands who had spent fortunes arranging ransoms were stunned when their wives refused to come home. Ministers thundered from pulpits about the dangers of going native, framing such refusals as evidence of moral corruption or demonic influence. Newspapers and pamphlets spread lurid stories, portraying those who stayed as victims of manipulation or madness, because to admit that they might have chosen their new lives freely was to undermine the colonial worldview itself. Yet for the captives themselves, the decision was often deeply human. Years spent in indigenous communities, especially when taken young, transformed their sense of self. They had new names, new kin, and new responsibilities. They spoke languages their families did not understand, practiced rituals foreign to their birth culture, and belonged to networks of care and obligation that extended far beyond blood ties. Many had children or spouses in their adoptive communities, bonds that felt stronger than the distant memories of a childhood left behind. To abandon those lives was not a simple return. It was a second kind of captivity. For those left behind, the refusal to return often felt like a betrayal, but it was also a profound challenge to colonial assumptions about civilization, loyalty, and identity. It revealed that the savage world they had demonized was capable of offering something powerful, belonging strong enough to outweigh blood, culture, and the pull of home. The letters and envoys that crisscrossed the colonial frontier tell a story not only of love and grief, but of two worlds whose values could not be reconciled. They show fathers weeping over daughters who no longer answered to their names, mothers clutching gifts that would never be accepted, and husbands staring across a cultural gulf too wide to bridge. The finality of those refusals left scars that outlived the conflicts themselves. Some families carried the hope of reunion to their graves, while others struck the names of lost loved ones from family records as though they had died. But they had not died. They were living lives beyond the edge of the colonial map, lives they had chosen. And in the quiet aftermath of failed rescues and unanswered pleas, the settlers, who had once believed that no one would ever prefer the forest to the town, were forced to face a truth that shook their certainty: that home was not always where you came from, but where you chose to stay. In the summer of 1754, as the French and Indian War spread across the contested borderlands of New England and New France, a woman named Susanna Johnson awoke to a nightmare that would define the rest of her life. She lived with her husband, James, and their children in Charlestown, a small frontier settlement on the Connecticut River, known then as Number 4. It was a lonely outpost, a cluster of wooden homes and fields surrounded by dense forests, where alliances and hostilities shifted with the seasons. On the morning of August 30th, a raiding party of Abenaki warriors descended on the settlement. They burst into the Johnsons' cabin before dawn, taking the entire family captive: Susanna, her husband, her sister, and 3 young children. Pregnant and terrified, she was forced to march north toward Canada, beginning a journey that would stretch for hundreds of miles and months of uncertainty. The march was brutal. The captives were given little food and less rest, their feet blistered and bleeding from the rough terrain. Along the way, Susanna gave birth to a daughter, whom she named Captive, on the banks of the Connecticut River. There was no midwife, no doctor, only the watchful eyes of her captors and the distant hope that they might allow her to live long enough to care for the child. Yet even in those desperate conditions, moments of humanity broke through the fear. An Abenaki woman helped deliver the baby, wrapping her in soft furs and carrying her when Susanna was too weak to continue. Another offered her food from their own scarce supplies. The raiders, who could easily have abandoned the newborn as a burden, instead ensured her survival. These gestures, though small, unsettled the stark colonial image of captors as heartless savages. Weeks passed as the party moved steadily northward, deeper into territory under French influence. Along the way, the Johnson family witnessed a side of indigenous society that few English colonists ever saw. Their captors were not a disorganized mob of marauders, but members of a community with rituals, kinship structures, and codes of conduct. They paused to offer thanks at rivers and forest clearings, shared stories around campfires, and treated each other with a deep sense of mutual responsibility. It was a worldview far removed from the colonial notion of wilderness as empty and uncivilized, one where even captives were folded into the rhythms of daily life rather than treated solely as spoils of war. When the group finally reached Montreal, the Johnsons were handed over to French authorities, who arranged for them to be distributed among different households as part of a broader political strategy. Susanna and her children were separated from James, and her daughter Captive was adopted by a French family. It would be 3 long years before they were reunited and eventually ransomed. Throughout this ordeal, Susanna never denied the suffering she endured, the hunger, the exhaustion, the grief of separation. Yet in the narrative she later published, a narrative of the captivity of Mrs. Johnson, she also recounted moments that did not fit colonial expectations. The kindness of the Abenaki woman who carried her baby, the restraint shown by warriors who could have been cruel, the dignity and order of a society often dismissed as barbaric. These observations carried weight far beyond her personal story. They challenged a deeply entrenched colonial narrative that saw indigenous peoples only as enemies, incapable of compassion or civility. Susanna's account complicated that picture, revealing a reality where captors could also be protectors, where the lines between victim and enemy blurred, and where cultural difference did not preclude shared humanity. Her experience did not erase the trauma of her captivity, but it revealed something her society was reluctant to acknowledge: that even in war, people on both sides could see and treat each other as human beings. When she and her family finally returned home in 1757, Susanna found a colonial world still eager for stories of savagery and redemption. Yet her narrative, despite its descriptions of hardship, could not entirely satisfy that hunger. It told a more complicated truth, one that defied the easy categories of good and evil, and in doing so, it forced readers to confront an unsettling reality: that the people they called enemies were capable of kindness, and that captivity, for all its suffering, could reveal common ground where none was believed to exist. For colonial families, the hope that a daughter or wife taken captive might one day be rescued was the single thread that held despair at bay. They prayed for it, plotted for it, and sometimes risked their lives for it, convinced that once the chance for return was offered, the lost would seize it eagerly. And yet again and again, the unthinkable happened. Women who had been recovered through ransom, negotiation, or military action slipped away from the settlements that had long mourned them and disappeared back into the forests. These moments were more than acts of individual will. They struck at the core of colonial identity and belief, forcing a society built on rigid notions of loyalty and cultural superiority to confront the unsettling fact that life among their supposed enemies could be chosen, even preferred. One of the most striking patterns to emerge from captivity records is how often rescued women fled their saviors. Some were taken back by force during raids, meant to recover captives, torn from the communities they had come to see as family. Others were brought home through negotiations, only to escape weeks or months later. The stories often followed a similar pattern. At first, the returned woman would seem quiet and withdrawn, struggling to reacquaint herself with the rhythms of colonial life. Neighbors would watch her carefully, interpreting every hesitation as a sign of lingering trauma. But then, without warning, she would vanish, leaving behind the world of fields and meeting houses for one of Longhouse's kinship and languages that now felt more natural on her tongue. To settlers, these acts were incomprehensible and infuriating. Sermons railed against what ministers called the seduction of the savage life. Newspapers described the women as victims of manipulation or moral corruption. In some cases, families refused even to speak their names, treating them as if they had died a second time. Their choices were cast as betrayals, not just of kin and homeland, but of faith, race, and civilization itself. The colonial worldview hinged on the belief that their culture was inherently superior, that to be taken from it was to fall, and that to return was to be redeemed. A woman who rejected redemption was more than a source of grief. She was evidence that those assumptions might be wrong, but from the perspective of the women themselves, the decision was often far simpler and far more human. Years spent among indigenous families had reshaped their lives in ways that could not be undone. Many had married and borne children. They had learned languages, taken on responsibilities, and built networks of kinship that extended beyond blood. Their daily existence was intertwined with people who relied on them and whom they, in turn, loved. Returning to colonial society meant abandoning not only those relationships, but also the sense of belonging and purpose that had grown around them. It meant exchanging a communal life built on shared labor and mutual support for a more rigid and hierarchical one, where their voices carried less weight and their choices were more constrained. Native communities understood these choices not as betrayals, but as affirmations. To them, the women's returns were proof of the strength of the bonds that had formed, evidence that kinship was not merely an obligation, but a force capable of transcending origin. When a woman fled back to the village that had once taken her captive, she was not a runaway in their eyes. She was a daughter returning home. The community would welcome her back without reproach, understanding that her brief absence had not erased the ties that bound her to them. These stories circulated widely on the frontier, whispered in taverns and recorded in colonial journals, each one chipping away at the comforting certainty that European culture was irresistible and inevitable. They revealed that captivity was not always a wound to be healed, but sometimes a transformation to be embraced. They showed that love, loyalty, and identity were not fixed by birth, but shaped by experience, and that those who crossed cultural boundaries could do so willingly, even joyfully. And perhaps most unsettling of all, they reminded settlers that the forests beyond their fields were not merely places of danger and darkness, but spaces where a different kind of life, one that many of their own people might choose, continued to flourish. Every time a woman slipped away from a colonial settlement and vanished into the trees, she left more than an empty bed behind. She left a question that no sermon or law could fully answer. What did it mean about the world they had built if someone, given the choice between it and the one they had been taught to fear, chose the latter? It was a question that would haunt the colonial imagination long after the frontier closed. The stories of captives who chose to stay with their adoptive communities or even fled back to them after being rescued reveal a deeper truth than simple emotional attachment. They point to a profound cultural clash, not just between Europeans and native peoples, but between two fundamentally different ways of organizing life. On one side was the colonial world, built on individual property, rigid hierarchy, and strict gender roles. On the other was a communal system that emphasized shared responsibility, collective decision-making, and a balance of power between men and women. For many who experienced both, the choice was not a mystery. It was a quiet, deliberate preference for a life that felt more human. In colonial settlements, survival was often a solitary and punishing affair. Families were isolated on scattered homesteads, far from neighbors, and separated by miles of forest. The household was the basic unit of production, and every burden, from raising children to planting crops, fell on the shoulders of the family alone. Women were confined largely to domestic spheres, their days consumed by endless labor, cooking, sewing, tending gardens, birthing and raising children, all while submitting to the authority of fathers, husbands, ministers, and magistrates. Social norms left little room for their voices in public affairs. A woman's worth was tied to obedience and piety, and deviation from these expectations could bring social ruin. Even within their own homes, they were subject to patriarchal control, their labor and their bodies regulated by law, religion, and custom. Life in many indigenous societies was structured in ways that contrasted starkly with this model. Villages functioned as extended families, where tasks were shared and responsibilities distributed widely. Childcare, for example, was not the sole burden of mothers. A child might be watched by older siblings, aunts, grandmothers, or even unrelated. Women, freeing parents to participate in other aspects of community life. This collective approach created a deep sense of security and belonging. It also meant that motherhood, far from being a solitary, exhausting duty, was integrated into the social fabric in a way that allowed women to maintain autonomy and identity beyond their children. Labor, too, was divided differently. While men often hunted, traded, or defended the community, women controlled agriculture, the production of food, and the management of resources, roles that gave them considerable economic power. Decisions about land use, trade, and even war were frequently made through consensus, with women participating actively in councils or even holding veto power, particularly among the Haudenosaunee. This stood in stark contrast to colonial society, where women were excluded from formal decision-making and where political authority was almost exclusively male. The absence of rigid hierarchies in many native communities meant that individuals were valued for their contributions and skills rather than their gender or social class. Even property was conceived differently. While colonial law treated land as private and inheritable, a source of wealth concentrated in the hands of men, many indigenous nations understood it as a collective resource to be used for the good of the community. This perspective fostered a sense of shared responsibility and cooperation rather than competition. Captives who had grown up in a world defined by scarcity, ownership, and individual struggle often found the communal ethic deeply appealing. In a society where the well-being of one was tied to the well-being of all, they felt valued not as dependents or subordinates, but as integral members of a larger whole. The psychological effects of this difference were profound. In colonial life, isolation was common, loneliness a near-constant companion. The demands of self-reliance left little time for leisure or collective joy. In indigenous villages, however, work and life were often communal. Meals were shared, stories told in groups, ceremonies brought people together in collective expressions of gratitude and remembrance. Daily life was infused with a sense of connection to the land, to one another, and to something larger than the individual. For those who had experienced only the rigid discipline and emotional austerity of colonial society, this sense of belonging could feel transformative. It is no wonder, then, that many captives did not see themselves as leaving civilization for savagery, but rather as stepping into a life that offered dignity, equality, and community. Their choices exposed the fragility of colonial assumptions about superiority and progress. The women who preferred native life were not rejecting their heritage out of ignorance or weakness. They were choosing a world that offered them freedoms and roles their birth societies denied them. And in doing so, they forced those societies to confront a question they were ill-equipped to answer. If their way of life was truly the pinnacle of order and virtue, why did so many who glimpsed another path choose not to return? The answer lay in the contrast between two visions of human existence, one centered on hierarchy, property, and control, and the other on reciprocity, balance, and shared purpose. For those who had lived both, the choice was not rebellion. It was recognition, and in that recognition was a quiet but powerful indictment of the society they had left behind. When a woman was taken captive on the North American frontier, her family and community often assumed her world had ended. They imagined captivity as a state of permanent victimhood, a stripping away of self, agency, and dignity. Yet for many women, what began as an ordeal of violence and fear evolved into something far more complex. In the villages and households of their captors, they encountered social structures, expectations, and possibilities that were radically different from those they had known before. Over time, this experience of living outside the narrow boundaries of colonial womanhood transformed their understanding of themselves. Captivity, in a strange and unexpected way, became a gateway to a different kind of freedom, one that redefined identity, power, and belonging. In colonial New England, or New France, a woman's life was tightly scripted from birth. Her path was shaped by family expectations, church doctrine, and civil law. She was to marry young, bear children, submit to her husband's authority, and devote herself to household labor. The laws of coverture, imported from English common law, meant that upon marriage she ceased to exist as a legal individual. Her property, earnings, and even her body were effectively controlled by her husband. Her voice in public life was almost non-existent, and her opportunities for self-determination were few. These constraints were often so deeply ingrained that they were invisible, accepted as the natural order of things. Captivity shattered that order. At first, the experience was terrifying. Women were taken from their homes, forced to march through wilderness, and thrust into alien societies where they understood neither the language nor the customs. But once the immediate danger passed and their new lives took shape, many found themselves navigating a very different social landscape. In indigenous communities, women were not passive dependents, but central actors in the life of the group. They owned property, directed agricultural work, participated in councils, and in some societies, wielded the power to select or depose leaders. Their opinions carried weight not only in the domestic sphere, but in the political one. For women who had spent their entire lives being spoken for, the experience of being listened to was transformative. This newfound agency extended beyond formal authority. It shaped how women understood their own worth. No longer confined to the narrow role of obedient wife and mother, they became producers, negotiators, decision-makers, roles that colonial society often denied them. Even the most ordinary aspects of daily life took on new meaning. Planting crops, helping to organize a seasonal hunt, or participating in communal rituals became acts of contribution that affirmed their importance to the whole. They were no longer invisible laborers working for the benefit of a single household, but valued members of a collective whose survival depended on their efforts. The psychological shift was profound. Many women reported feeling a sense of self that they had never experienced before, a sense that they were more than property, more than vessels of obedience. This change did not erase the trauma of their capture, but it reframed their understanding of what it meant to live a meaningful life. Freedom, they realized, was not simply the absence of chains or the ability to return home. It was the capacity to shape one's destiny, to speak and be heard, to act and be respected. And in many indigenous societies, they found that freedom, in ways that colonial life had never permitted. This transformation helps explain why some captives resisted rescue or felt alienated after returning to their former homes. Having experienced life as agents of their own futures, they struggled to accept a return to silence and subordination. They saw clearly, often for the first time, the limitations they had once taken for granted, the laws that rendered them invisible, the customs that stripped them of autonomy, the expectations that confined them to obedience. Their minds had outgrown the world that awaited them, and no amount of nostalgia could make it fit again. To their families and neighbors, these changes were incomprehensible. How could a woman prefer a life in the forest over the comforts of home? How could she see herself as free among those who had once held her captive? But the paradox was only apparent from the outside. From within, the truth was clear. Captivity had dismantled old definitions of freedom and replaced them with something richer, deeper, and more personal. For many of these women, the choice to remain with their adoptive communities was not a rejection of their past, but an embrace of their present selves. Selves they had discovered only by stepping beyond the boundaries their birth societies had drawn. In that discovery lay a quiet revolution. It was not fought with weapons or laws, but lived through daily acts of choice and belonging. And though colonial society might never have understood it, the women who walked away from their old lives were not running from home. They were walking toward freedom, a freedom defined on their own terms, born from an experience that had begun in fear but ended in self-realization. The repeated decisions of captives to remain with their indigenous families did more than break the hearts of colonial households. They threatened the ideological foundations of the societies they had left behind. Every woman who refused ransom, every child who slipped away to rejoin their adoptive village, chipped away at the colonial conviction that their way of life was not only superior, but ordained. If the civilized world was truly a higher form of existence, why did so many who had experienced both choose the one they had been taught to fear? It was a question colonial leaders could not afford to ignore, and their responses over the 18th century reflected both their alarm and their determination to reassert control. Propaganda, law, religion, and policy became the tools with which they sought to pull back those who had crossed the cultural boundary, or, failing that, to convince themselves and their societies that crossing it was shameful. One of the most powerful weapons colonial governments wielded was narrative. Captivity stories, which had begun as deeply personal testimonies like Mary Rowlandson's, were repurposed as public instruments of persuasion. Pamphlets, sermons, and broadsides portrayed captivity as a living hell, an experience defined solely by violence, degradation, and despair. Ministers thundered from pulpits that women who stayed among native communities were victims of temptation or corruption, their souls endangered by proximity to heathen practices. Preachers compared indigenous villages to biblical Babylon, places where once pure Christians were seduced into abandoning their faith. Even the language of official proclamations reflected this fear, describing those who did not return as lost or fallen, rather than as people who had chosen a different life. The intent was clear: to frame going native not as a choice but as a moral failure. Authorities also turned to policy. Frontier militias were strengthened, patrols increased, and laws were enacted to regulate interactions with indigenous peoples more tightly. Trade restrictions were sometimes used to limit the exchange of goods and information that might facilitate assimilation. In some colonies, legislation required returning captives to undergo interrogation and religious re-education before being allowed to reintegrate into their communities, a process designed to erase the influence of their time away and reaffirm their loyalty. Governments funded missions and schools near indigenous settlements, hoping that Christian instruction and European-style education would discourage cultural blending and produce intermediaries loyal to the colonies rather than to native nations. Religious institutions took the lead in this cultural counteroffensive. Churches organized special services to redeem captives, framing their return as a form of spiritual salvation. Ministers wrote lengthy treatises warning of the dangers of intermarriage, shared rituals and syncretic practices that blurred the lines between cultures. Even art and literature were recruited to the cause, with plays, poems, and sermons depicting indigenous life as chaotic, lawless, and cruel. The goal was not merely to prevent future captives from assimilating, but to reassure colonial populations that they were right to fear and despise the alternative. Yet despite these efforts, the narratives of those who stayed continued to circulate, whispered in taverns, recounted in family stories, and recorded in the journals of missionaries and traders. These accounts, though often dismissed or distorted, had a quiet power. They spoke of women who had found autonomy and respect, of children who had grown into leaders within their adoptive communities, of lives that were not tragic but fulfilling. Even colonial officials could not entirely suppress their curiosity. Reports sent back to London and Paris occasionally noted with bewilderment that former captives showed little desire to return, and that efforts to retrieve them were often met with refusal. These stories undermined colonial confidence in ways that no military defeat could. They exposed the fragility of a worldview that depended on stark divisions between civilized and savage, Christian and heathen, freedom and captivity. The persistence of such accounts suggested that these categories were not immutable, that people could cross from one side to the other, and more importantly, that they might prefer it. The very need for propaganda, religious campaigns, and legal constraints revealed the depth of colonial insecurity. By the late 18th century, the anxiety over going native had become part of the colonial psyche, shaping policies far beyond the frontier. It influenced treaties, trade negotiations, and even the rhetoric of imperial expansion. Yet despite every attempt to rewrite the story, the reality remained stubbornly unchanged. Women continued to choose their adopted families. Children grew up and never came back. And the line between the worlds, no matter how many walls the colonies built, remained permeable. In the end, it was not guns or forts that most troubled colonial authorities, but the quiet, unanswerable testimony of those who had lived both lives and chosen the one they were never meant to choose. Their decisions spoke volumes, and no sermon or statute could silence them. Long after the frontier raids had ended and the borderlands of colonial America had become part of a new nation, the stories of women who chose to stay with their indigenous families continued to ripple outward. They were told and retold, reshaped with each generation, and absorbed into the cultural memory of two very different societies, one that sought to suppress them as cautionary tales, and another that cherished them as proof of kinship, resilience, and continuity. These narratives did not vanish when the women themselves passed away. Instead, they became part of the deep historical soil from which both settler and indigenous identities grew, influencing perceptions of belonging, loyalty, and identity long after the original events had faded from living memory. In the colonial and early American imagination, the figure of the lost woman lingered as a symbol of both fear and failure. Ministers continued to invoke her story from the pulpit, warning their congregations about the temptations that lay beyond the boundaries of Christian society. These sermons painted the forest as a place of spiritual danger, a space where faith could be eroded and civilization itself undone. Pamphlets circulated well into the 19th century, describing the experiences of captives who had fallen to the influence of native life. Even when written decades after the fact, they still portrayed the decision to stay as something unnatural, the result of weakness, deception, or moral corruption. Colonial authorities and, later, American officials used these stories to justify assimilationist policies, arguing that indigenous cultures were powerful precisely because they were seductive, a narrative that underpinned efforts to convert, educate, and ultimately erase them. Yet even as official rhetoric tried to control the meaning of captivity, the stories themselves resisted confinement. They spread in quieter, more subversive ways, woven into family histories and local folklore. Among frontier families, tales of a daughter or sister who had vanished into the forests became part of the collective past, often told with a mixture of sorrow and disbelief. Some families maintained faint contact with their lost relatives through letters carried by missionaries or traders. Others heard rumors of children and grandchildren living among the Haudenosaunee, the Shawnee, or the Delaware. Descendants who no longer spoke English, who no longer practiced Christianity, but who were nevertheless blood. The knowledge that their lineage continued beyond the colonial world, unsettled deeply, held assumptions about race, culture, and belonging. For indigenous communities, these stories were remembered differently. They were not tales of loss, but of renewal. Oral histories celebrated the courage of women who had crossed from one world into another and stayed, strengthening the bonds of kinship and expanding the community. These women were remembered not as outsiders, but as ancestors, their names carried forward in songs, stories, and clan traditions. In some cases, their descendants rose to positions of leadership, becoming chiefs, matriarchs, and keepers of cultural memory. The fact that they had once come from outside the community was not a mark of shame. It was evidence of the community's resilience and its ability to incorporate and transform. Even centuries later, the legacy of those decisions could still be felt. Anthropologists and historians, tracing family lineages in Haudenosaunee or Abenaki villages, found descendants of women taken in the 17th and 18th centuries. People who carried English or French surnames generations removed from their origins. In some cases, they were aware of their ancestors' stories. In others, those stories had become so deeply woven into the fabric of their identity that they were no longer distinct from the rest of their heritage. These living legacies testified to the enduring power of those long-ago choices, reminders that cultural boundaries, once crossed, could remain blurred for centuries. The persistence of these narratives also shaped broader conversations about identity in North America. They complicated simplistic notions of cultural purity and challenged the idea that indigenous and European societies had remained separate and distinct. Instead, they revealed a history of intermingling, of kinship formed in the most unexpected ways. For settler societies, this reality was often inconvenient, undermining national myths of conquest and domination. For indigenous peoples, it was a source of strength, a demonstration that even in the face of violence and displacement, their cultures had not only survived, but had grown by incorporating others. Today, the echoes of these stories continue to resonate. They appear in novels, historical accounts, museum exhibits, and community oral traditions. They shape debates about identity, belonging, and cultural continuity. And they serve as reminders that history is not a fixed story told from one perspective, but a tapestry woven from countless lives and choices. The women who stayed left more than memories behind. They left descendants, traditions, and a complicated but enduring legacy that continues to challenge how we understand the past. In their stories, we see how captivity can become kinship, how loss can become renewal, and how the choices of a few individuals centuries ago still shape the identities of nations and peoples today. By the end of the 18th century, the stories of women who had been taken from their homes and had chosen to remain among their captors had become more than historical curiosities. They were windows into deeper questions about what it meant to be free, to belong, and to know oneself. They challenged assumptions so deeply woven into colonial culture that few had ever thought to question them. Captivity, in the minds of most settlers, was supposed to represent the total absence of freedom, a state of domination, humiliation, and helplessness from which one must escape at all costs. But the choices these women made, to stay, to build, lives in unfamiliar worlds, to refuse rescue, revealed something much more complicated. For many of them, captivity was not an end to their freedom. It was the beginning of their first real experience of it. At its heart, this transformation was about identity. Colonial society was rigidly structured, its hierarchies firmly drawn. Women's roles were defined almost entirely by their relationships to men, as daughters, wives, and mothers, and their value was measured by how well they conformed to ideals of obedience, piety, and domesticity. A woman who strayed from these expectations, even briefly, risked condemnation and disgrace. Within indigenous communities, however, identity was often more fluid. A person could be reborn through adoption, renamed, and woven into a kinship network that valued their contributions regardless of their origin. Women could exercise authority, own property, participate in decisions, and shape the future of their communities in ways that colonial society seldom allowed. The result was a profound redefinition of self. Women who had once been confined to narrow roles discovered that they were capable of more, that they could lead, speak, decide, and influence. They were no longer merely passengers in the story of their own lives, but active participants in shaping its course. And because this transformation occurred within a framework of community rather than hierarchy, it often felt more authentic and more empowering than the so-called freedom they had known before. Belonging, too, took on a different meaning. In the colonial world, belonging was primarily a matter of birth, of lineage, religion, and nation. To belong was to be born into a particular identity and remain within its confines. The stories of captives who stayed shattered that notion. They demonstrated that belonging could also be chosen, built, and nurtured. It was not simply something one inherited, but something one created through shared work, shared memory, and shared care. The women who remained with their adoptive communities did so, not because they had forgotten where they came from, but because they had found a deeper, more sustaining sense of home. This reimagining of freedom and belonging had consequences that rippled far beyond individual lives. It exposed the cracks in colonial ideology, revealing that the systems of power and belief that Europeans had brought with them were neither universal nor inevitable. It forced colonial society to reckon with uncomfortable truths, that its vision of civilization was not always more desirable, that its structures of authority were not always just, and that the people it sought to dominate were capable of offering alternatives that many found more compelling. The very existence of these choices undermined the colonial project's claim to moral superiority and universal destiny. Even centuries later, the implications of these choices continue to resonate. The descendants of captive women still live. In indigenous communities, their identities shaped by decisions made long before their births. Their presence is a living reminder that identity is not static, that it can cross borders and defy expectations. And the stories of their ancestors continue to challenge modern ideas about assimilation, hybridity, and cultural boundaries, reminding us that the lines between us and them are far less fixed than we often imagine. For the women themselves, captivity was never a single, simple experience. It was fear and suffering, yes, but it was also possibility, a tearing open of the world that allowed them to see themselves and their place in it anew. It was the spark that illuminated the difference between merely existing and truly belonging, between being constrained by circumstance and shaping one's destiny. In that sense, captivity was not an ending but a beginning. The beginning of lives lived on their own terms, in worlds they helped to shape, and in identities they chose for themselves. Their stories endure not as tragedies, but as quiet revolutions, proof that even in the darkest moments of history, human beings can find ways to reclaim themselves and redefine what it means to be free.